So I'm with Adam Bryant today, the author of Quick and Nimble and author of an earlier book, The Corner Office. Adam has been the innovator, the inspiration, and the writer for the Corner Office weekly column in the New York Times for the last several years. He's been interviewing CEOs and studying leadership and culture. And today we're going to talk to him about what he's learned in the course of scores and scores of interviews and 2 different books. Adam, thank you very much for doing this.
Of course.
I want to ask let's start with a few basic questions. Where did you get the idea to do this, and how do you pick the CEOs you interview?
Sure. It's a pretty simple story for how I started it. I was a business reporter here at the Times through the 1990s. I think you were my first enterprise editor, so you remember we worked together when I started in the Detroit bureau. So as I said, I was a business reporter here for 10 years through the 90s. And during that time, I interviewed a lot of CEOs just from covering a lot of different companies and industries. And what I realized over time, it sort of sounds obvious to say it now, but I realized that CEOs are pretty much always interviewed the same way in the business press, which is as strategists. If you look at most CEO Q&As in the business press and you boil them down, they're basically 2 questions, which is what's your growth plan and what's the competitive landscape? Again, interviewing the CEOs in their role as setting strategy for the company. And that's fine, I enjoyed doing them, but I just found the more time I spent with these CEOs, the more I found myself just wanting to ask them really simple questions like, how do you do what you do? And then I became a manager myself about a dozen years ago. And then I found myself wanting to ask these CEOs, how did you learn to do what you do? Because I think people have always had this funny notion of CEOs that they're kind of a subspecies of the human race, that they were born leaders, from the time they were in diapers, they knew exactly how to do it. And I thought, well, that can't be right. So I rolled all of that up into a very simple what if, which is what if I sat down with CEOs and literally never asked them a single question about their companies, and instead just talked about leadership lessons they've learned over the course of their lives, how they lead inside their company in terms of culture rather than how they lead in their industry. I was asking them how they hire, what questions you ask, what qualities you're looking for, and what advice they give to new college grads. So that was kind of the initial idea, and I think I'm more than 425 interviews now, and rapidly coming up on 500. So.
Wow. When you evaluate who you're going to interview, what do you think makes a good, what are the ingredients for a good candidate for an interview? And then we'll get to whether, in fact, you thought they were good interviews or not.
Sure. I guess to step back, when I launched Corner Office, I set myself some guidelines for who I was going to reach out to interview. And I really wanted from the very start to kind of embrace diversity in literally every sense of the word, not just the traditional senses: race, gender, nationality, industry, small company, large company, for-profit, not-for-profit. I look for leadership everywhere, not just in companies. I've interviewed Mario Batali, the chef, Kenny Chesney, the country music star. I interviewed a Broadway production stage manager. So I really want to get that sort of diversity. One of the other guidelines I set for myself was that I was going to interview a lot of women, because I've always been surprised at how few women there are in the top ranks of corporate America. But there was a special thing that I added, which is that I was going to interview a lot of women, but I was never going to ask them any gender-specific questions. So I was going to interview them the same way about leadership that I interviewed men. I was going to interview them as leaders who happen to be women as opposed to women leaders, because I feel like it'd be nice to move on from a lot of the traditional conversations. I mean, I'm always surprised if you go on YouTube and you see very often, frankly, a female journalist interviewing a woman, a female CEO. The conversation often starts with, so you're a wife, you're a mother, you're a CEO, how do you do it all? And if you watch closely, there's this look in the eye of the CEO where they're just dying for a minute, and sort of you can just sort of see them saying, like, are we really doing this again? over the years, most of the women that I've interviewed, they have thanked me for not asking the work-life balance stuff. And I'm not saying work-life balance isn't an important issue. I just don't feel like there's a lot of, new ground to plow there. I think the issues are fairly well known. So anyways, I thought like it'd be nice to imagine a world where women are interviewed in the same way as guys. So that's kind of the broad brushes. I get pitched all day long. No exaggeration. Every day I get about 12 pitches from companies, internal PR people, external PR people saying, please interview our CEO. A lot of the CEOs themselves reach out to me and say, please interview me. And so I'm kind of like the doorman at a club, and I get to decide, who gets in. And there's a long line, and it's a luxury that I enjoy. I mean, I do this as a side gig in addition to my busy day job. So I can be incredibly choosy. And it's been an interesting front row seat on the public relations industry because, first of all, most people don't know how to pitch me. They send me the same pitch that they send to the trade publication. So revenues are up, profits are up. They just did this acquisition. They've got, launched version 3.0 of the cloud mobile security software program, and I don't care. And so, but the stuff I'm looking for is just some details and specifics of how they lead. I'm looking for interesting backgrounds. So those are kind of the table stakes. When I get on the phone with the PR person, I always tell them the 3 most important words are candid, open, and honest. And I tell them, look, if your CEO is not those 3 things, then we probably shouldn't do this, because just because I interview them is no guarantee that I'm going to run it. To their credit, a lot of the PR people have sort of said, well, maybe we shouldn't do this. Because, I tell them, I say, look, if I interview your CEO and it doesn't go well, I say, that's going to be a waste of my time. It's going to be a waste of your CEO's time. And then I do a dramatic pause, and then I say to the PR person, and it's going to be really bad for you. What I'm trying to avoid is the politicians, right? The people who just kind of speak in platitudes and generalities, and teamwork is important because it's important to work together as a team. I mean, there's been 4 interviews that I've done that I haven't run, and so I really look for that sense of like, are you going to be? Do you have an interesting background, and are you going to be honest with me about your failures? And it's one of the many reasons why I start off with the question, tell me about when you were a kid. Because you can't really lie about that, right? You can't spin that. And tell me about your parents. Nobody ever asks them these questions, so it's not like the PR person can prep them. And usually a good acid test question for me is I always ask everybody, tell me about when you were a manager for the first time. Because everybody is horrible as a first-time manager, right? It's very rare that you get somebody. Managing people is incredibly hard and difficult, and we all make our mistakes when you first start doing it. And that usually, it's a good test for me about how honest you're going to be with me. Because if people go, no, it was great.
Then it's not the full truth.
Right. So that's kind of how I choose, and a lot of it is sort of is based on gut. Like there's some detail in there that I haven't seen before, and I generally like and am impressed by everybody I meet. I'd say, there's probably 2 broad groups of people. When I'm interviewing them, I want to like keep talking with them, and let's go have a beer and let's go have dinner because you click and there's so much to talk about. And then there's other people who I really enjoy the 60 to 90 minutes I spend with them, but then we're kind of done.
Is that usually how long it takes to do one of these?
Yeah, I always book 90 minutes, and the shortest ones take an hour and the longest ones take 90 minutes. So it's usually somewhere in there.
And you run about, in the Q&A that appears on the web and in print, you run like 30% of the questions or 20% of the questions?
No, it's actually, I throw out like more than 90% of the interview. So I record the interview. I use this transcription service. When the transcripts come back, they're anywhere from 9 to 15,000 words, depending on how fast the person talks and how long the interview goes. And then I condense that down to like 1,000 words. So you can get a sense of how much I'm cutting out. I mean, there's stuff that I'm condensing, and then there's stuff that I'm just taking a machete to and cutting it out because it's not that interesting.
While we're at that point, I want to come back to what you've learned from interviewing the CEOs. But while you're at the point of being the editor, the students will be evaluating about 10 or so interviews that you've done and then writing a paper about them. And then they're going to go pick candidates of their own, and they're going to videotape their own interview. That's
great.
Second half of the semester. Let's talk about the second half of the semester first. What advice do you have about how to pick a candidate for this? And when you were first starting out, how did you describe what you wanted to do to those candidates?
Well, so when I launched Corner Office, I had this somewhat vague, somewhat specific idea of what I wanted. I mean, just that I'd spent time interviewing these CEOs and that I felt that there was something more there. So I had this clear idea of what if I never asked them a single question about their company. The CEO that I launched Corner Office with is a guy named Greg Brenneman, who I knew from my days covering the airline industry in the mid-90s. He was the president of Continental Airlines. I had interviewed him a few times. Crazy smart, crazy candid and open. Say if something was BS, he'd be the first to tell you. And I had clicked with him, and so he's now running a private equity firm. But I reached out to him and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." And so pretty soon after that, the line started forming at the door of people wanting to get in the club. But again, I'm repeating myself, but like candid, open, and honest. Like
Right.
It
Okay.
is very easy for it's very easy for people to just default into just kind of generalities or just walking through their resume. For the people in your class who are going to be doing the interview themselves, I mean, the real X factor is in your listening skills and your interviewing skills, because when I'm interviewing these people, just like your students will be interviewing executives or whomever, literally 5 times a second, the person who is being interviewed is making conscious or subconscious decisions about how much to tell you.
Right.
Right?
Sure.
And so, I interviewed the last CEO I interviewed, he told me that when he was in boarding school in high school, and he got expelled for 2 weeks. And I said, what happened? And he told me this story about how he had figured out how to get alcohol. And he had figured out better than any of his other classmates. And he figured out that if he grew a stubble and wore these big coats and went downtown 2 miles from school and bought liquor at 8 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, he figured that they would never ask him for ID, because why would a student, and because all the students go, it's Friday night, we need booze.
Right.
And then they get carded and they can't buy it. So he figured this out. And it's that's a great story, right? And so you want to hear those stories, but literally 5 times a second, he's making decisions based on, he's looking me in the eye and he's, figuring out, do I trust this person? Am I connecting with this person? Does he understand what I'm saying? And you just think about all the people that you meet in the course of your day. You're always making decisions like, how much do I share with this person?
Sure, of course.
And it's not some con. I mean, I'm generally interested, genuinely interested. And for your students, that they're going to find that simply that it's a very basic human skill, but most people, frankly, don't do it very well. That basic skill of being completely present in the moment and clearing your mind, so you're not thinking about, I've got this meeting with class to get to, and being an active listener, with body language and sharing your stories. And I always think of eye contact as the broadband of communication. I mean, you can look somebody in the eye and know if they're listening to you or if you're present. And I've been doing this so much, I can even recognize the moment for me, because to me, it's sort of like active meditation when I'm doing these interviews, because for that period, I can't be thinking about anything else. I may have 5 meetings to go to after it,
Sure.
And I've seen the moment where if I start getting distracted, you can sort of feel the like butterflies, these thoughts sort of come into your head. At a very subtle level, it changes the interview because they know. And again, I think a lot of it is subconscious, but you can tell that they know that I'm not locked in on them and not that I'm not listening. And so they'll probably subconsciously pulling back a bit. So to me, it's always like, being present in the moment and being a great listener is a big X factor in how good the interviews are.
After all these interviews, can you come away with a few common traits about successful CEOs and leadership?
Yeah, I came up with this phrase, and I don't think I've coined it or anything, but it to me it captures the quality that runs through all of them. It's what I call applied curiosity, which I think of as different than idle curiosity, because idle curiosity is like you've got that kind of brain, you can absorb facts, and when you go on Jeopardy, you're going to win some money, right? There's that kind of curiosity. Applied curiosity to me is just this kind of habit of mind they have, which is that they are just this relentlessly questioning mind about, they go into any situation, they start thinking like, how does this work? They literally just start like, how does this work? And then they go like, how can it be made to work better? And I think a lot of these CEOs, they drive their spouses crazy. Because I've heard this story a few times, it always makes me laugh, which is that, if they go to the shopping mall, like just on a Saturday afternoon to pick up stuff, the spouse is like in the store buying stuff, and the CEO is standing there, let's say it's a him or whatever, and literally, okay, like figuring out, okay, this is the square footage, this is the throughput. If they change that line, they could get more throughput. And CEOs have told me that they will like literally go and talk to the manager and say, I'm guessing your profit per square foot is X. Is that about right? And the manager goes, how did you know that? Right? So meanwhile, the spouses are going like, can we just go shopping? And that's what, to me, any situation, it's like they're always breaking it down. Like, how does this work? There's this kind of relentless processing of experience. I think that's the other thing. In society these days, we're so focused on creating the right path, right? If you're a parent, you want to get your kid on the right path to success. And there's this sense that some paths are better than others, and certain schools are better than others. And if you just get on the right path, you will succeed. And from having interviewed more than 400 of these leaders and hearing their life story, there is no path. And the only difference is that whatever experience they're having, the image that I have is like this towel that absorbs the experience like water. And then they take the towel and they just keep wringing it. And just like, they'll get every ounce of insight and lesson out of whatever they're doing in the moment. Because I mentioned that I interviewed this Broadway production stage manager, and he told me that he learned everything he needed to know about putting on a Broadway production from being an assistant manager at McDonald's as a teenager, right? And he said, look, it's kind of the same. You have to put on a consistent product every night and a diverse crew, right? And so to me, that's just a great example of how somebody could say like, I don't want to be an assistant manager at McDonald's, or somebody was an assistant manager at McDonald's and said, I was just an assistant manager at McDonald's. But for this guy, he had the experience and he kept his eyes open and he learned from it. And that's the common theme that I find. It's like somebody, I interviewed a CEO like who literally broke his back playing soccer in college and, was bedridden for like a year and a half. But he learned stuff about himself, and it sort of, read a lot and changed a lot and got over the victim thing pretty quickly and like made the most of it. And to me, that's just that thing of like being completely present in the moment, that relentless questioning mind, and just taking whatever experience you have and getting all the lessons out of it. And to me, that's like the one thread line through all of them.
Do you think this is trained and learned, or do you think there essentially is just a little piece of DNA code in all leaders?
It's, the leadership skills, I think there's an aptitude that can be learned. It's sort of like an athlete. Like some people are born with, natural athletic skills, but you have to be trained. It's not like you're an awesome whatever. You have to improve. I do think a lot about this curiosity thing. Like, is that something that you're just kind of born with? To me, it's relentlessly fascinating. Like, where does, because you see people, I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience, Len, where, if you're sitting in a room with 20 students, there are some that just have this kind of like neon buzz around them. There's just kind of like they're on, and they're in it,
and they've got ideas.
Yeah, and
they have ideas.
Just look at their yeah, and you look at their eyes, and they're just like they're in it and they're on it, and they're curious and they want to know. And I mean, I've interviewed CEOs who said they would literally hire somebody just picking them out of a crowd and say, "You're going to be my assistant." There's this one guy who says, and when I say assistant, it's not like administrative assistant, but like his right-hand man or woman. But he's done this. He's literally picked people out of a crowd, just like based on, their body language, the questions they have. And I don't know where that comes from. I think partly it's just like, how long can you hold on to that sort of like childlike, this is pretty cool. Some point, because we're all born with that. Like, this is pretty cool. Like the first time you eat ice cream, it's like, that's pretty cool. And then over time, does that sort of enthusiasm, get reduced?
Can you name 2 or 3 of kind of innovative ideas that you've heard over the course of these interviews about leadership management skills?
Yeah, there's one that I teach this leadership course up at Columbia, and it's one of the things that I teach is something called a user manual for managers. And, as the name implies, it's basically, if you're a manager, it's sort of like, how do your employees get the best out of you? I mean, let's make this real. Like, I worked for you at one point, right? When I was first started writing stories for you, I didn't know who you were, right? And to me, you were kind of a silhouette, right? And I didn't, and it was only going to be over the course of doing stories together that I was going to find out what you're like as a manager, right? So the theory behind the user manual is like, what if the first day I show up on your doorstep and start working for you, you either talked to me or handed me a piece of paper that basically was your user manual, right? The things that, the things that are particularly pet peeves for you, like what are your quirks, right? Like we all have them as managers.
Sure.
The stuff that like drives you crazy, the stuff that, if I knew would earn me like 3 extra gold stars with you, like what if you communicated that to me on the very first day? And so I interviewed the CEO, and it was the first time I heard about it, but he said, yeah, I've got this thing, this, user manual that I give to all my employees. And so I said, love to see that. And it was very sort of confessional and candid. And it's like, I'm a work in progress. And a lot of things like sometimes I tend to do this and I'll appreciate you if you remind me. And then I did that interview and I talked about the user manual. And the day after it appeared, I got an email from another CEO saying, I've got one of those too. So I interviewed him, and he literally, his name is Luke, and it's called Blueprint to Luke and His Quirks. And he talks about like, these are some things you need to know about me. I started seeing sort of aspects of that from other CEOs. And I think it's, when I do this exercise, even with CEOs, it's kind of like taking a cork off a champagne bottle. Like as soon as you explain to them the framework, they start like scribbling madly. And I've had CEOs who have put this idea to use in their companies because it just makes sense at a fundamental human level, right? It's like, if I knew what your quirks were on day one, that's going to save me a lot of time. And I think it's a better, everybody talks about things like Myers-Briggs, and companies like hire Myers-Briggs, and they come in and like, you're an ENTJ and I'm a IFQR or whatever. I've interviewed CEOs who say they're like really into Myers-Briggs, and I'll say, well, what are you? And they'll say, well, I'm an INTJ. And I'll say, I'll sort of role play. I'll say, I was afraid, what do those things stand for? And they don't even know. Right? So like, what use is that?
It's no use at all. Let me shift gears and ask you to think in terms of a new graduate entering the workforce.
Yep.
What do you think, given what's going on inside various cultures, in creative shops, let's just take advertising, PR, newsrooms, what kinds of cultures do you think new graduates have to kind of encounter or will encounter, and how do they adjust to it? We've read a lot of your book. We've read a lot of the brain book as well. And in many cases, students tell me these are almost ideal goals for the way a culture and a leader should function.
Yep.
As a student, I'm working as a file clerk in a law firm, and it's a pretty dismal place. Nobody talks to each other. They're all behind partitions or in offices. It's a processing firm where maybe they're doing foreclosures. One, it's a kind of a two-part question. What can a lower level employee do in a culture like that? And what kinds of other cultures might they encounter when they first set out in their first jobs?
I'll take the last first. I mean, I think the best way to think about corporate cultures is sort of like countries. I mean, literally every country is different, right? It's got its own unique culture. And frankly, like every party you go to, I mean, if you're on campus, and every party has its own vibe to it. And I think that's true for company cultures. And just like when you go to a party, at a frat on a Saturday night, we all have the ability, the skill to read a room and figure it out. I think you have to start and lower your expectations. I mean, most bosses on the planet are bad bosses, right? So the chances are that your boss is going to be a bad boss is very high. So you shouldn't be surprised when that happens. Most cultures are pretty dysfunctional. So you shouldn't be surprised when that happens. It's, if you get in a great company, especially in your first job out of college, it's hard to know how awesome it is, right? Because it's the way it should be.
Right.
It's sort of like the difference between running into a headwind or, having a tailwind at your back, right? You're going to notice the bad ones more. So I would lower your expectations for that. I think the thing that I've learned just in my own career and then from interviewing all these CEOs is that it is very easy to stand apart from the pack because so few people do the basics. And the basics are, like talking about getting the job is a whole other discussion. But once you're in the job, to me, like one of the most basic things is that if you are the person who, are you going to develop a reputation as being reliable? And it's not just on the big stuff. I've heard this expression from one CEO, and I think about it a lot, which is ratio, which is what percentage of the things that you say you're going to do you actually do on a consistent basis? And if you really focus on that and, never say you're going to do something and not do it, because all of that just sort of feeds into your reputation. And if you say you're going to do something and you can't do it for whatever reason, you should go tell people, say, look, I said I was going to get you this by Thursday. These 3 things happened. I'm sorry about it, but I want to let you know as soon as possible. People are okay with that. But there are very few people in life who have a really great say-to-do ratio. And if you do that, if you consistently, even the small things, the large things, always do what you say you're going to do, you're going to stand out from the pack. If you show interest and enthusiasm and expand your network. And I know networking is like one of those words that some people get sounds icky, but if you just show interest, if you are working in a department and you get there and, you know, it's like volunteer for stuff, get involved, say, can I buy you lunch? Can I buy you a cup of coffee? If you show energy and interest and enthusiasm, people will respond to that. Most people don't do that. They think that communicating is sending an email. And so again, the thing that I keep coming back to is that if you show the basics, if you do the basics, you will stand apart from the pack. But get to know people, get involved. Action equals leads to opportunity. That was something I heard from one of the CEOs. I think about it a lot. It's very simple. Get involved, do stuff. One CEO called it play in traffic, which I like a lot. Just like get out there, go do stuff. Because if you play in traffic, you're going to meet people, right?
Right, absolutely. You may get killed too, but you may get opportunities.
Yeah.
Have you ever had blowback from employees of any of these CEOs who say, you know, that all sounded pretty good, but the say to do ratio is pretty weak, and or just anybody who's taken exception to exception to the interviews?
Yeah, it does happen once in a while where I'll get the email and say, you know, oh my God, you were so snowed, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess I've got a few thoughts about that. First of all, you know, there's a lot of disgruntled people, right? I mean, you know, the website Glassdoor, which is, you know, Glassdoor is all about anonymous comments from employees about the company, about the leadership. And sometimes if I'm considering interviewing a CEO, I'll go on that. And it's sort of like reading a restaurant review, like, you know, you're going to see best meal of my life. And, you know, the service was terrible and the food was terrible, right? And so it's always hard to know. One of the ways when I'm editing the interviews is that I really try to steer clear of generalities and just sort of broad platitudes, and really focus on stuff that is factual. That like either they do it or not. Like when I'm asking about culture and they say, you know, every Friday we get together around a big table and we have lunch and, you know, we play this game or whatever. But like that's either a fact or it's not, as opposed to them putting their spin on something. So I think that's why I don't get a lot of, man, you were snowed. Because I'm not just like when I'm interviewing, again, I throw out more than 90% of the interview,
right.
And
right.
It's to focus on like the stuff that's really sharp, really focused, and is factual or not. Like if this person said they did that, I mean, if you're a CEO, you really want to be lying in the pages of the New York Times? Like it's not worth it.
Right. Right. No, absolutely not. Any parting advice you'd have for people who are going to do their own little experimental corner office interviews?
Sure, and I'm happy to send to you. A previous class a couple of years ago, for them, I wrote up kind of my tip sheet on doing the interviews, doing these interviews. So I'm happy to share that with you. But I think